Yeah, so talking about a separate piece, had you guys do some preliminary work looking at the idea of setting, historical setting, physical setting, and also had you start working on some of the characterization aspects with the characters of Finney and Jean. Um, but today I wanted to go over a little bit some other important elements that we're going to talk about in the novel. So let's start talking about the idea of the narrator, which is something we've talked about all year as far as different points of view, first person and third person, and that when you have a first person point of view, it's very important to understand the characteristics of that narrator. And so, first person point of view, of course, uses the first person pronoun I, and you get a sense of the voice of the narrator, particularly the tone of voice that the narrator would be using throughout. So, with the character of Gene, um, as I mentioned in the assignment of the day, everything's coming from his point of view. So when we hear about Finney and we hear about the other characters in the novel, everything's coming from this perspective of Gene. So it's really important to really understand who Gene is as a character. So for today's assignment, that's going to be a part of what I'm going to have you guys look at as far as um, Gene as a character and how his particular point of view and what he's presenting to the reader from his perspective, how that really influences the way in which the story is told and the way in which the reader receives that story. So a big part of that would be tone or tone of voice, the author's tone of voice. So when we talk about speaking, we say that you use a certain tone of voice. It's usually clear if someone's angry, if someone's trying to be sarcastic or funny. But as we've talked about before, when you're reading something, tone isn't always so easy to communicate. It's sometimes more subtle. But the idea is by looking at the language that the narrator uses, trying to characterize, identify that tone of voice that the narrator uses, and use that to kind of help establish um, the characteristics of that narrator. So in the case of Catcher in the Rye, for instance, Holden uses a lot of sarcasm. He expresses a lot of anger. Those things are very important ideas to understand him as a character. The way he uses language is establishing a lot of his characterization as well, and that's going to also inform his the conflicts that he has and how he develops as a character. So what goes into tone, establishing tone, a big part of it is diction. As you know from what we talked about before, diction is an author's choice of words and how they use language. And there's a couple elements to that we're going to get into in a second. But that's something you want to look at closely when you're looking at Gene and how he uses language. Um, Diction is made up of denotation, which would be the actual dictionary definition of the words. We covered this a little bit earlier in the year, if you remember. Um, and connotation, which is also important, which is more of a psychological association, emotional association that you would make with words. So language is always operating on those two levels, or words, I should say, are always operating on those two levels. There's a certain dictionary definition that's being communicated, as well as a certain emotional or psychological association that a reader or a listener is going to make. So in the case of Gene, he's an older character. He telling the story. He's not like Holden 1 year later telling the story. He's doing it from the perspective of an adult, and so his use of language is going to reflect that. Whereas Holden was still basically a teenager telling the story, with the character of Gene, we have an adult who is now looking back and telling the story. So it's a much more mature voice. So let's look at this sample from the very first part of a separate piece, um, and look at the way in which Gene's diction is being used here. So he says that he went back to the Devon school and found it looking oddly newer than when I was a student there 15 years before. So that gives us a perspective of his actual age. It seemed more sedate than I remembered it, more perpendicular and straight-laced, with narrower windows and shinier woodwork. You can see the sort of geometric pattern there to the use of language. But of course, 15 years before, there had been a war going on. Perhaps the school wasn't as well kept up in those days, and perhaps varnish, along with everything else, had gone to war. So you can see here that I've highlighted these things that reference the past. I went back when I was a student there 15 years before. I remembered. He emphasizes again the passage of time by bringing up the 15-year period in those days, which is referring to the past. So it very much from the beginning kind of establishes this idea of looking backwards, and this idea of revisiting a place from your youth when maybe you're not so young anymore. And so these words highlighted here make the point of um, things that are changed, but maybe also there's certain structure to them as well, as I mentioned before, the kind of geographical pattern. But things are oddly newer, and that goes along with this idea of being varnished, but that it's more sedate. And then the perpendicularity, the straight-laced nature of it, the narrowness of it. And it's kind of when people go back to a place that they went as a child, as an adult, and what they see as the differences there. So when we talk about the diction, you notice the way that he's using language here is very formal, contrasting that with Holden Caulfield's narrative again, which was informal. And the tone is established as something that is reflective or contemplative, because he's someone who is, again, had perspective and had time to sort of think these things over, and then going back, finding the place to be very different, and that reflects also the differences that would be in the character as well. So what I want you guys to do with this is looking at the chart that you worked on last week for Finney and Jean, the character chart, and I want you to focus on one area of life. You choose whether it's sports, school, rules, or outlook on life. And we want to look at this from the perspective of Jean's point of view. So what I want you to find or identify is a passage in the book, a paragraph, like the one that I just showed you on the video, that's going to address Jean talking about one of these four areas. And what I want you to, how I want you to respond to that is, I want you to focus on the diction that Jean is using in that passage, as well as the overall tone that's established through Jean's writing. And so all this information will be on Veracross. You want to check that as far as the details and the specifics. But in focusing on that, we already know, the point of view is first person. We know it's Jean, but it's more about really looking at how the way in which Jean tells the story reflects who he is as a character. And so whatever passage you choose, I'm going to have you identify some specific words that relate to the diction, and come up with some specific adjectives that relate to the tone, and then make that final connection from the point of view / narrator, and how the narrator tells the story, as far as what that also reveals about the narrator. So like I said, check Veracross for more specific details. If you have any questions, concerns, issues, problems, please contact me. Okay, talk to you later. Bye.